Uh, Hi, everybody. I hope we're getting the door closed now. OK. So I hope that you guys have had fun last night with the data night out. And hopefully, you guys are not too hungover. And don't go to sleep in the middle of the session here. My name is Lalit Jina. I'm a developer on the team that makes the Tableau Server on Linux possible.
My name is Casper Ryder. I'm also a developer on the same team, and we're very excited to bring Tableau Server on Linux to you guys, just like you asked.
Casper has been with the team for about 2 years, and I've been there for roughly around 4 years now. It's been a fun journey so far. And as many of you have heard, Tableau Server on Linux has been on beta for a long time. This is a product that many of you have asked for. Many companies actually, the only reason they run Windows is because they want to run a cluster of Tableaus, and everything else they have is on Linux, right? So they have to manage 2 different kinds of clusters: Windows clusters for Tableau and Linux for everything else. Some of you want to install Tableau on the cloud, and on the cloud, licensing for Windows is more expensive. You have to pay for the license of Windows to Microsoft, right? And some people just prefer Linux over Windows, just because they do, and there is no reason for that. So we have worked hard to make sure that the same experience that you had on Windows is also available on Linux here for you, right? The Linux distributions that we support currently, they are like Ubuntu, CentOS, Red Hat, Oracle, the standard ones. And as more of them become available, you'll see them in the documentation online. The biggest difference you'll see is because of Linux being inherently different from Windows, the architecture is slightly changed. We'll be talking more about that as we go through the session here. And also, we'd like to go through the agenda briefly, because here's what you're going to get from the session, right? First and foremost, we are obviously going to try and see what's different with this new version of Tableau Server on Linux. Not only the differences in the architecture, but also what's different from your day-to-day activities perspective, right? What's different that you have to configure and all those kind of things. For the migration from Windows to Linux, this is the main topic of today. We'll talk about what are the things that you would want to migrate, what are the things that you can leave behind, and how you would go about migrating this based on your situation, based on how large your installation is, based on how much downtime you can take, and things like that. We'll look at each one of those things. We'll present some scenarios for you. We may not be going through all the possible scenarios, but your scenario will fit somewhere between one of the scenarios we present. And it will also leave you with some more material to go through, and so that you can figure out what works best for your organization, for your installation of Tableau here. Q&A is welcome. We are going to have a huge time in the end for Q&A so that you can ask your questions. But if you feel like you need to ask any question during the session itself, please feel free to ask. If it's going too long, we'll just shelve it till the end. OK, so what's new on Linux here?
OK, so first we wanted to talk a little bit about what's different and what's new on Linux versus Windows, right? And we're not going to go into a lot of details, because this is not the subject of this talk. But we wanted to briefly touch upon the little things that you're going to hit as soon as you start moving your environment from Windows to Linux. And there's a couple things that we wanted to cover. The first one is the new security model. So for Linux, for Tableau Server on Linux, we built a new security model from scratch that is to make the platform as secure and locked down as possible. Under this security model, we create 2 accounts on every node that will be in your Linux cluster. Those accounts are local accounts, non-interactive, non-logging accounts with very low permissions, no permissions on the network whatsoever, and permissions on the local resources are only restricted to everything that Tableau needs and nothing else, right? One of the accounts that we call Tableau Agent has a little bit elevated permissions, and we use this account to run just one service that has to manage all the other services. So this account has to have a little bit bigger permissions to manage those services, to interact with the operating system interfaces. Why is this important? Well, security is important in general, but this will have some impact on the second bullet point there, the remote data access with run as users. So a lot of users, a lot of our customers use a specific setup where they specify an external account, like an Active Directory account, to run the services as for the remote data access connectivity. And it's a pretty common scenario, so we're going to go into a little bit more details later as we speak, because it's pretty important. The next new thing is a new API, administrative API, and we're very happy about it. So on Windows, the way you would manage your server, you would run your admin commands, you would use your tab admin, right? And you had to log into the primary box. You could not do it from any worker nodes. You could not do it from any other computer you had. And you had to be on that local box and run your tab admin commands. With Tableau Server on Linux, no longer. We have a new REST API that can be accessed from anywhere. You can easily program against it. So it's very convenient if you want to automate your things and do it from other computers. We also ship a companion app, a CLI companion app, that is just a very thin wrapper that actually makes these calls. But if you prefer to use a command line, and it's easier if you want to script against it, this is still available. Command line is still available. We call the new command line TSM. And it's almost like tab admin used to be, except it's actually just making calls to the REST API. There is one thing to keep in mind is that it's not exactly compatible with the tab admin, so there are slight differences. So if you have existing scripts that you use, that you have to automate your tasks, these will need a little adjustment. But it's almost one-to-one, so it should be relatively easy to change those scripts to the new command line. With the new REST API, all the access has to be authenticated, right? So in Windows, it was enough to just be on that primary box, right? As long as you have your admin privileges on the box, you're able to administer your server. With the REST API, every call has to be authenticated. So, and with the CLI also, you have to authenticate when you start using it, and then you get the session cookie, right, and everything else, all the subsequent commands you can just run without additional authentication, but that initial authentication has to happen from anywhere you connect. And the last final difference that we wanted to mention is that we no longer have assigned primary. So on Windows, you had a primary. You would have a separate installer for a primary and then a separate installer for workers, and that's the way how you would set up your cluster. On Linux, we ship only one installer, one package, either RPM or deb package. You use that to install all the nodes. We no longer have primaries, so all the nodes are equal in the cluster. You can take them in and out as you please. You don't have to worry, oh, this is my primary, and I have to take special care of this. All of them are equal, so we think it's very convenient, and it will make management easier. One consequence of this is that you have to follow a special process that we call bootstrapping for establishing your cluster, so that these servers know each other, they trust each other. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later in the talk, but something to keep in mind when you set up your cluster. So there you go.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about migration strategies, but before we go forward, anyone have any questions regarding the previous, what we've covered so far? Yep. So at the moment, the Windows and Linux sort of look different, but the architecture is moving towards a common architecture. We will be moving towards a common architecture. Yeah, this is what ships on Linux, the first thing. Anyone else? Okay. So yeah, we are very proud of the REST API and the CLI being able to run from anywhere, and that's really like yay, REST API. You can program against it and do whatever you want. So talking about the migration strategies that we are going to follow. These are the basic things that go with any kind of migration that you might do with any service that you host. Like downtime. No one likes downtime. We want the downtime to be as little as possible, right? Sometimes for the sake of data consistency, you have to take downtime, because when you're migrating, if you're still making the data available to the users might modify it. The modifications may not make into the system that you're migrating into. So those things have to be considered. And an important thing as a result of moving to Linux is that where and what kind of hardware you have also becomes a huge factor here. Some of you might have been on the side thinking, hey, we have this Windows cluster in some data center, and we want to move to the cloud. And this might be a good chance. With Linux, it's really easy to move to the cloud, so this might be your opportunity. Or you might be one of the customers who bought like really powerful hardware because you want to maximize the utilization of the Tableau licenses you have, right? And you want to use the same machines again because you spent a lot of money on these machines. So that is something to consider during this migration strategy here. And for some reason, I don't see a reason why you wouldn't like the new thing, but if you don't like the new things, or if things go wrong or something unexpected happens, we want to make sure that rollback is as easy and simple as possible, and that it doesn't take you days to roll back to your own old system, just in case if you need to. So in general, the process will look like this. Like, you will create a topology. If you have designed a topology for the Windows cluster already and you want to reuse the same topology, yes, you can. Or if you can go with a totally new topology if you want here. There might be certain customizations that you made on the Windows cluster that you want to carry over. And some customizations you might have set up after much thought of your process and how long things take and timeouts and various things. We'll go more into detail into that. But you can take your configuration. You don't have to, but you can. And finally, obviously, you have to move the data. So when you first install a single machine of the new Tableau server, you're going to get everything that you would need to run an instance of a Tableau cluster on that machine, just like what you used to get before. However, the processes here are slightly different. The most important process in that is the agent. The agent is actually responsible for managing the lifecycle of everything else on that cluster. It's also responsible for upgrading if some of the packages need to be upgraded. It takes care of all of that stuff for you. Configuration and lifecycle of the individual processes, all of that. Agent is the most important process here. And you get a copy of that. You get a copy of the controller. Now, controller is this process that's hosting the REST API that we just mentioned. It's responsible for giving you the bootstrapping process that goes on when you add additional nodes to the cluster. So you get one copy of the controller on the cluster at the moment, but in case that copy goes down, you can always spin off another copy using a very, very simple process. We continue to use Zookeeper for cluster coordination. We used to do it before, but now we do it even more. It's very important. We use it for coordination for your Postgres repository, and your configuration and your topology information, everything goes in there. And we have been using cluster controller for your Postgres failover, right? I don't see a reason why we wouldn't have two copies of Postgres, the primary and the secondary, and this is managed by a cluster controller here. And you do get a copy of each of the application services that you would need, like the rendering services like VisQL Server and VisPortal, and you get a data server, and you get a copy of Hyper, because it so happens that Hyper is shipping roughly around the same time, so you get a copy of Hyper along with it. One very important difference, Casper mentioned this before, that you can no longer add machines to the cluster like you used to do before. Earlier, on Windows, what you had to do was install the worker on a machine and say, I trust the cluster, and just add me to the cluster, and any machine could join the cluster, right? Obviously, that was not a great security model. So we have changed that. Now, to join an existing cluster, you have to first get a certificate file. It's called a bootstrap file from the machine that's running the controller. You get it. It contains the certificate that's required to establish trust for the connection, and also contains the address of where the controller machine lives. So now when you install a worker machine, I'm calling it a worker machine, but it's just any machine because we don't have primaries and workers anymore. When you install another machine, you just provide the certificate to it during the install process, and it automatically bootstraps to the primary one. Everything is trusted and authenticated, so you only have machines that have this certificate be able to join the cluster. So you won't have problems with ghost machines in the cluster and things like that. Okay? This is something that I would like to stress a lot, but first I would want to see if any of you have any questions regarding what we have done so far. Any questions? Yes, please. So the licensing processes still stay the same. None of the control processes actually use a license at all. Yeah, that stays the same. Okay, so we have had sessions on this about stressing the importance of high availability, but I would like to stress it again. We strongly recommend that you set up high availability for everything as much as you can. Some of them are for utilization purposes, like maximum utilization of your hardware, and some of them are for in case something goes wrong, you have an extra copy of everything. You definitely want to have an extra copy of Zookeeper, as we said before, because it's hosting all the coordination data, the configuration of your system, the topology information, and so on and so forth. You definitely want to have a copy of that. There's a very simple process for this. We're going to leave you with the link on how to do that. And repository, the Postgres repository, you definitely want to have the second copy of that, the primary and the secondary. In case something goes wrong, you get automatic failovers. Something goes wrong, also you don't lose all your data, right, in case you forgot to take a backup or something. The controller runs a single copy, as I said, but you can always spin off another copy using a very simple command. And in future, we may have more copies if needed. And Hyper and other application services, obviously you want to have more copies of it, right? Because you want the end users to have continued service in case something goes wrong. One copy of this portal goes down, no rendering. That's not a good thing. You definitely want to have more than one copy of that. So as soon as you have 3 machines in your cluster, you definitely want to have high availability set up for all of these processes. Zookeeper, they recommend, after one process, they recommend 3 or 5. You want to have odd number of processes for Zookeeper. For Hyper and other application services, depending on your licenses and depending on how much capacity you have and what your requirements are, you should definitely set up high availability for those. Any questions? Okay. So let's talk about the initial configuration here.
Right, so after you set up your cluster, and actually, in fact, some of the initial configuration has to happen as you provision that first node of Tableau Server on Linux. Right, there are some settings that you set as you initialize that cannot be changed later, and this has to happen when you set up that first node. So we're going to talk about 2 things, licensing and identity store. So some of you may be wondering how, I already have a license for Windows. How do I move this to Linux? Do I need to get a new one or whatever? The good news is that no, you can just move your existing license to Linux. Your license, the license you have for Windows should have enough activations to actually activate on Linux. And then when you're happy with your Linux setup, you can deactivate the Windows one to reclaim those keys. So that should be seamless and it should just work. If you guys have any issues with that, our licensing team is going to work with you to figure it out and make it as smooth as possible. The next thing is identity store. So this is one of the things that has to be set up as you provision that first node, right? You set identity store to kind of manage your users and groups. And this cannot be changed later after you set it up initially. So just like on Windows, we support local identity store in which Tableau Server manages all the users and groups and permissions for you. We also support Active Directory through the LDAP protocol. So that will pull all the users and groups from Active Directory just like it did on Windows. And we also support all the other directories that adhere to the LDAP protocol. And we have a GS API and simple bindings to them. So this should all just work. One thing to keep in mind with Identity Store is that you don't need to recreate your users and groups when you set up that initial node, right? When we move your data from Windows to Linux, we'll move this with all the users and groups for you. So you don't have to do additional work to migrate that. So once we have initial configuration done, we come to the run as users. So this is I mentioned this briefly in the beginning when we talked about the run as users. And this is one of the scenarios that a lot of our customers use, especially if they are using Active Directory and SQL Server as their data source. This is a pretty common setup. And the way it works to kind of streamline the remote data access using impersonation on the SQL Server, right? And this is very important to a lot of customers. The way they set it up is we create a custom account in the Active Directory that we use to run Tableau services as. You specify that account on a Tableau server. You create a user account on a SQL server with impersonate permissions for the data for all the users. And your users have specific permissions onto some of the data sources or some subset of the data sources. And the Tableau server can use that external Active Directory account to connect to SQL Server and impersonate those users so that they're only able to access the data they have permissions to. So this is a very common scenario on Windows. Now, I said on Linux, we always run as these two, actually one Tableau account that is a local account with no permissions anywhere. So is it still possible on Linux? The good news is it is still possible, but it requires a little bit additional setup. But the process is still relatively simple. It's just a couple of configuration keys. So the way you would do it on Linux, you would have to first, you already have the account created, right? Because you already have a Windows account, Windows setup that is using that run as user account that is provisioned specifically for Tableau Server. You would reuse that account, or you can create a new account if you wish. And you would use a set of Kerberos utilities to create a key tab file for that user account. Save it as a file, right? And once you have that, it's just a couple configuration keys on your Tableau Server on Linux to enable the Kerberos and specify, I want to use this account for that remote data access connections, and I want to use that key tab file that I just created to enable this, right? So this is almost as simple as Windows, and it just works. So any questions to that?
The Kerberos, are you using the Kerberos impersonation?
Yes.
Okay,
So
then you can use multiple key tabs for multiple users, right? Because if you use Kerberos, I realize that if you don't use Kerberos impersonation, you can only use one key tab file, so you can only have one account. So
well, I think for this feature, you can only use one account, right? Like you will not be able to specify multiple users like that.
you cannot specify multiple users.
No.
Okay, so if I have, say, two projects, one server, that I need two accounts to log into the server, with that.
Well, I think because that account, like on Windows, it used to be used to run the service as, right? So it was a single account that all the services would run as, and that account would then be able to connect to all the.
Without taking more time from your specification.
Yeah.
Oh.
Because Kerberos has also impersonation that solves this problem that you can have multiple key tab
Right.
files.
Right.
Perhaps you guys should look into that.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
Yeah. Thanks. Okay. So the next thing you can do is to migrate your remaining configuration. There are some additional keys, configuration keys that you might have set that you might want to migrate. Now, this step is completely optional. You can start from scratch with the new Linux cluster and just configure it as you go. But it's probably easier to just use your existing Windows cluster as a base and to move those configurations that you know you need, right? So on Windows, the way you would configure your server, you would either use the tabconfig utility, which is that UI that has most of the most common settings, like identity store, SAML, Kerberos, email settings for subscriptions, all these kind of things that you can customize. The other way you would specify your configuration is through tabadmin set commands, which allows you to specify all these additional configuration settings that are not exposed through the UI. And some of you know there's a ton of them that you can customize to make your server run the way you want. Both of these utilities write to the tab.sbc YAML file that we put into the Tableau data directory in the config subdirectory. So the first thing, if you want to use this as a base, is you would go to your Windows cluster and get this file from the primary node. Once you have that, we'll have to sanitize it a little bit. Unfortunately, you can't move everything as is. Some of the things you can move, some of the things we can't. So for example, passwords. All the passwords that you had in your existing cluster in the configuration, they are encrypted, of course. So we cannot just take them and move them over to the new cluster. They will have to be specified again. But it's only for the external passwords. All the passwords that are generated on the cluster, they would be regenerated on the Linux cluster, so you don't have to worry about that. Topology on the Windows, topology is also a part of configuration. It's stored in a configuration file. We already recreated our topology, either your exact replica of the Windows or something else that suits your needs. So we don't have to worry about topology again. We can skip those. Anything that requires additional files for configuring, so SSL, it requires certificates. For SAML, we need the metadata from the IDPs. For Kerberos, we need key tab files to configure that. We can't easily get these files from the existing cluster. So all these settings that you need to provide some additional input, that will have to be specified again. But all the things like ports, maybe you open up your ports on a file wharf so the services can connect to each other. You might want to move those guys. Timeouts, maybe you work with our support. Some of the things we're timing out, maybe you increase some of the timeouts. If you want to move those, these are very simple to move. All the email settings for notifications, external accounts, this can be moved. Any alert thresholds, cache refreshes, pretty much any custom settings that you specified will be in this file, and you can use this as a base to move to the Linux. So once we have it sanitized, once we have what you want to move and what you don't want to move, we would use a TSM command, and this can be easily scripted, right? You can write a simple script to run a set of TSM configuration set commands, and then you would apply the changes after you said everything you want. We are still right now, all of this is manual, so you would have to specify each of these values manually. We're still in beta. We're working to automate this process, so maybe you would be able to take that YAML file and just import it as a whole in one form or another. But even if you have to do it manually, it's probably just going to be a handful of settings that you should be able to easily move or just script. All right, so this is about configuration. Is there any questions to that before we move to data?
Okay, so before we go forward, we're going to present 3 scenarios in front of you, but want to remind, Linux is awesome, but want to also give you certain limitations that we have at the moment. We support almost all the data sources that were supported on Windows, but there are some data sources that don't have drivers on Linux, and those may not be supported. I think you can get the list of them there are very few. You can get the list of them in the online docs that we have. Also, the factors that really affect, as we discussed before, what your strategy would be for migrating from Windows to Linux. Downtime, we want low downtime, and the data consistency, we want to have data consistent to whatever is acceptable to your organization. You're a banking organization, you want everything to be 100% consistent. Yep, there's an approach for that. If you can tolerate a lot of, a little bit of loss of consistency, there are faster approaches here. And ease of rollback, we'll be considering ease of rollback. And obviously, we'll see what is the best way for you to use your available hardware, or if you're going to move to a totally brand new cluster here, right? We're going to look at all of those. We'll go through one by one. One nice thing, though, is that all the formats of backups on Tableau, like whether it's a backup of the entire site, or it is a exported site, just a single site that you backed up, all of those are still compatible with the new Tableau. So anything exported from before will be compatible with the new version of Tableau. So that's nothing we need to worry about. So let's take the approaches one by one, and we'll first go with the simplest approach here.
Okay, so yeah, we're going to present like 3 use cases, different scenarios, depending on different factors and your requirements. And the first one is a simple backup-based migration. So who would this strategy be good for? We think this would be good for customers that have relatively small data sizes, maybe something up to 100 or 200 gigabytes. And actually, the data size doesn't really matter. It's as long as your backups and restores are fast. Like you know from your experience how long your backup takes, how long it takes to move it somewhere, how long it takes to restore. So as long as this process is pretty fast, you will be able to use this approach because the amount of time it takes to back up and restore will be basically your downtime. So another kind of requirement for this is that downtime is not an issue for you because you're going to take the server offline for the duration of migration. So maybe you have a window of time during the weekend or at night that you can perform this. If the downtime is not an issue, this might be a good strategy for you. This scenario maintains full consistency because we're going to take the server offline, so there will be no modifications to the data or to the workbooks during the time. So we have a full data consistency. And this scenario will only work if you have ample hardware, right? If you have additional servers that you can provision the Tableau server on Linux on, you can use that. If you maybe you deploy your Tableau server on VMs, maybe you deploy in AWS. So you can just spin up new virtual machines to recreate that cluster. So this is a good scenario for it because we kind of keep the copy of your Windows cluster while we create a new Tableau server on Linux on a different hardware. So let's go step by step how this would look like. And if there are any questions along the way, feel free to stop me. So we'll start with a simple Windows cluster. We have a primary and 2 worker nodes. But this scenario would work for pretty much any setup, even single node. But let's take 3-node example here. We have a basic high availability with 3 nodes and a primary and dependent and passive repositories. So that's our starting point. So how would we go about moving that? The first thing would be to provision that new machine, image it with your favorite Linux distro that we support, and install that first node of Tableau Server that comes with all the services that you need to run the Tableau Server, right? So you got all these copies of these services. So once we have that, we can migrate our configuration the way we talked about it before, right? So we take the tab.sbc YAML file. We would use a new command line TSM to make all these configurations happen. And it's best to do it on the first node because then when you join additional nodes, they will be able to just reuse that configuration right away. So once we have the configuration, we can provision additional nodes, right? So at this point, you have recreated your topology. It can be exact same replica what you have on Windows. It can be totally something else if you want to make changes during the process. But we have a Linux cluster almost ready to go. At this point, we would take the backup, so we would shut down the old server, stop it, so no further modifications can happen. We would take the backup, just like you always do with the tabadmin command line. And like Lalit said, all the backups are compatible, so we can just take this backup and restore it onto the new cluster. And this way, all the data, all the users, all the workbooks, all extracts will be moved to the new cluster. So relatively straightforward and simple. So at this point, you have like your exact replica of the cluster ready, and it's ready for testing. So you can do your testing, whether everything works right, if you're happy with it. At any point, if anything is not right and you want to roll back, the old cluster is still available. Like the rollback scenario is basically just to turn it back on, and the users can still use it. Right now, it's turned off. So if you want to roll back, it's just basically turning it back on. Right? Once you're happy, once you tested everything and everything seems to be working fine, you can switch your load balancer to the new cluster, and at this point, and turn it on. And at this point, users can start using the new cluster just like they used to do on Windows. External load balancer will route the traffic to the new cluster. There is no impact to the user whatsoever. At this point, you can decommission your cluster, reclaim those machines, reclaim those virtual machines, and the migration is done. Any questions to that scenario? Yep.
Can you export the configuration and import it to the Linux?
Yes?
Do you have to install the other nodes, or it was auto provisioned?
Well, so when you install, you can do either, right? You can specify those configurations at any point. Like, I think it's easiest if you do it on the first one, so that when you join additional nodes, they would just get all the configuration that you already set. That's not what you're asking? Okay.
I asked, you had like a Windows machine, and with which was a multiple
Yes.
distributed environment and a single machine on the Linux side, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you took the configuration, which is actually multiple machines, and you import it to the single machine of the Linux side. Did you have to manually then install the 2 other machines, or the Linux provision?
Oh, no. You have to provision them automatically. So we don't, like we said, like it's not recommended to move the topology over, right? You only said, you would only move over like the global settings. You have to sanitize this file.
So actually, I have to install the 2 other nodes
Yes.
and set it up.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, the configuration and topology are 2 different things. Like how many processes you have of each on each machine. Those are the things we're not taking. We're not migrating those.
Yeah.
We only migrate things like ports and timeouts, and you may have certain passwords for external email account or
So
thresholds.
in the old, in the tab admin in a Windows world, actually topology was part of the configuration, right? So when you set up your topology, it would actually go into configuration and it will follow the same process. With Linux, it's a little bit more detail that we wanted to go to, but on Linux, topology is completely separate from configuration, so you have to set it up separately, and the configuration process doesn't even touch topology. Okay. So yeah, any other questions? Yeah.
So in the Windows, like we have TDEs, and in the new Linux box, like you're saying, like you're having a hyper.
Yes.
How the migration is going to be, it's automatically taken care of?
Yes. So the extracts, you would move the extracts, you would restore, and the extract would be restored as just like they were, as a TDE extracts. The first time that Hyper wants to use them, they will be converted to a Hyper form.
Like when you back up, you don't
No.
The experience is seamless.
Yeah.
You'll not see any difference.
And
Yeah.
when we are migrating out, like, we need to upgrade our servers, like on the Windows to the 10.5, and then move it to Windows, or like 10.1, we can move it from there.
No. The backup formats are compatible.
Yeah, yeah.
You, yes.
Oh, yeah.
So his question was like, do you have to update the Windows version to the latest version before you migrate to Linux? And the answer is no, because the backup formats are compatible.
And the other question was about about the format of the extracts when you move from TDE on Windows to Hyper on Linux. How do we upgrade the extract format?
We had a question over there first. Yes.
So what you said in migrating over to Linux, or we do have Sbase as a data source. Would this new version of Linux allow for a hybrid environment, Windows and Linux, to accommodate the limitations on Sbase?
We don't have a hybrid model yet. I don't know if you have plans for that, because all the machines are running Linux on the cluster at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, hybrid mode is not going to be supported.
Yeah. Yes, backups are compatible, yes. Yeah, the question was, are backups compatible, and a backup from Windows, we can just restore it on Linux? Answer is yes. Yes. Yes, please.
Yes.
Yeah, the question is, would the restore have to be a no config? In the new world, the restore is different, because earlier you used to do tab admin restore something. Now it's TSM restore. There is no configuration-based option for restoring anymore.
But inside, it is using no config. Like
Yeah.
it is a no config.
It's
restore.
no config, yeah.
Yeah.
Any other questions before we proceed to the next one? Yes? So the question is, whenever data engine is down, you have to recycle the entire environment. So is it the same on Hyper? I don't believe you need to do that. Only the data engine recycles when it's down.
Publishing doesn't work when that particular service is down. So we have to recycle the environment so that data engine should come out. Whereas that is a Windows thing.
So what does your high availability cluster look like? So if you have more than one copy of the data engine, if one of the data engines goes down, the publishing should continue working on some other data engine. It should. And if one of the data engine goes down, it is supposed to be brought back up without the cluster having to restart at all. And the same should be true with Hyper. Yes. If you're having trouble with where the data engine is not restarting without the cluster restarting, that is an issue we need to look at. You should definitely contact support for that. That shouldn't be happening. Any other questions? Okay.
So let's move to
Yeah.
more advanced scenarios.
Yeah. So this is a scenario for really large corporations. They have a single IT department supporting many different departments. So what they typically do is they silo information of each department into a site. And Tableau supports this concept called site, where all the information is kind of grouped together in a site. So because the information here can be so large that taking a backup of the entire thing and then restoring it again may take way more time than would be acceptable. So you have the option of going site by site. It's very similar to the backup restore option, but what happens is, other than the site that is being migrated, all the other users will continue accessing their data. So availability is not affected for everybody at the same time, right? So let's see. We're taking a simple scenario here. Typically, these organizations are going to have way more than 3 machines. Let's say we have 3 machines, the basic need for high availability here, copies of everything as needed. You set up your Hyper cluster, the cluster with the new Tableau here. And we have showed 2 different load balancers here. You don't have to go with this configuration. You can choose your own configuration where the new cluster is merely a redirect under the same, same load balancer for a different site. You can do that, but that's totally up to you. It doesn't affect the scenario by itself, right? You do this. You take a site that's available on in the old Windows cluster here. You put that in suspended mode. Users cannot modify it anymore, right? You do a site export using tab admin export site, the old command. You get a site which is backwards compatible and forwards compatible with the new Tableau server. You do a restore. After it's restored and becomes available, The users are now free to access it here. You can now start redirecting the users to this new load balancer or ask them whatever your mechanism may be. Send them an email saying, hey, your site is now available with this new URL, or do the automatic redirect based on your load balancer. You can do all the validation checks, everything. In case everything is OK, you can just go ahead and delete the old site from the old machine. Or if you're not happy, you can just delete it from the new machine and continue using the old one by pulling it out of the suspended state. So rollback is really, really simple here, right? Any questions regarding site-based migration? It's not a scenario that many people use, and one caveat is that backup restore is significantly faster than site import-export, but when there are many, many sites, migrating one site at a time might actually be faster in terms of how much downtime individual site users see. So that's the approach that the site-based migration people would take. So this is a scale-up, scale-down solution. This is for customers that have really powerful machines and want to reuse the same machines. They want to use the same machines because these machines are powerful, and then you want to maximize the licensing, the license of Tableau here, right? So we're trying to maintain low downtime with this process and also trying to maintain access while this upgrade is going on. So I'm showing 6 machines here. You may have fewer than 6 machines. The reason I have 6 machines here is because we want to show high availability before and after and during the process. But if you have fewer than 6 machines, it is still possible to do the same thing, but I'll explain that towards the end, how to do in case you have less than 6 machines here. So you have the basic high availability scenario here. You have copies of everything. You have copies of the repository. First thing you would do is take one of the machines that is going to be in the target cluster, pull it out of the load balancer, wipe it out, and install your choice of Linux, one of the supported ones, and install the first instance of the new Tableau Server on it. Next, you would migrate all the configuration that you would need into the new cluster here, do anything that you might need to do to set it up. Take a backup. Remember, the site is still accessible. You're taking a backup. So after this backup is taken, any modifications that happen to the data, like people, if they're modifying the vizzes, for example, those are not going to make it to the new site. But if changes are happening as a result of refreshes happening on the extracts and things like that, those refreshes are going to happen again on the new cluster, so you don't have to worry about that. So that's something to keep in mind. You take the backup, do a backup restore using the regular backup restore process. Once you're done with that, now you're going to start growing the new cluster while reducing the size of the old cluster, right? You want to hit a high availability situation with the new cluster. You have the high availability with the new cluster. As soon as you hit 3 machines, the old cluster is still available. You do your testing here on the new cluster. Something is wrong, you can just roll back. As with all the other scenarios, if you're not happy, you can easily roll back. If you're happy here, which I think you will be, just switch over to the new cluster, right? Any questions before I explain how to do this with fewer machines? Yes?
Did I interpret it correctly that you had a moment, or at least a period of time,
Yes.
where the load balancer was balancing between Windows and Linux boxes?
So the question was that, was the load balancer balancing between the Windows and Linux boxes? Answer is no, because there is a slight switch between the Linux and Windows. So there was a short downtime when the switch was being made between the Windows cluster to the Linux cluster. Yes, yes, please.
But when you did it site by site step, then you said you can allow some of you to Linux and some of you.
Yeah. Yeah, the question is, in the side-by-side case, you could redirect some users to the old cluster and some to the new cluster. And in this case, you could choose to do that if you want to, but I don't see a reason why you would do that, because they would continue modifying your Windows cluster.
Well, you mentioned the side by side.
Yes.
If I go to this option and just sending all users from a specific site, like the local to the Linux, with all the others, they are migrated will be sent by text, the ones that
Yeah, in the side-by-side, yes. Here, that won't be the case, because all users are going at once. Yeah. When you do the backup restore here, you don't have to reprovision all the users. Users and everything, all of those are being migrated to the Linux cluster. You only merely have to connect to whatever authentication mechanism you had, LDAP, all of those. you have to make sure you're connecting to the same system again. That's it. The users are still there. So yes, please. Yes. I think
No, you'll
there's
have
nothing
to.
like that.
No,
But Active Directory is supported. The question is, if we are using Active Directory, if you move to Linux, do we have to move to LDAP? But you could continue using Active Directory. Active Directory is supported.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
You would have to reprovision the users, right? Yeah, that would be a hassle.
Well, when you do a backup restore, either backup restore or site migration, you are moving users as well. So you pretty much have to use the same identity store that you used on Windows, right? Because these users are going to be migrated over.
Can I switch from AD to LDAP? Let's say I migrated from Windows to Linux. Can I switch AD to
I haven't tried that.
So
but
to use
yeah.
LDAP binder to the AD? Is that what you're asking? Or?
Yeah, let's say only one environment. I have Linux environment, I have AD. Can I switch to LDAP? Drop the AD?
You would have to reprovision the users, though.
Yeah. And you cannot have a mixed mode, so you can't just move
Yeah.
one department. Like you only use one identity store, right?
Yeah. Okay. So, once you have that, obviously, once you're happy, you're going to get all the machines and, convert them to the new Linux cluster. Now, if you have fewer machines, remember that all the components that make Tableau high availability possible don't need a license. Like Zookeeper, it doesn't need a license. So what you can do is you can actually add cheap machines to your cluster during and before the migration so that you have high availability on both sides. You don't really need to buy more licenses just because you want to maintain high availability during the migration process. You can just add machines, add Zookeeper to it, add repository to it, and then not have to worry about these kind of things.
You can even add a simple virtual
Yeah.
machine somewhere for the high availability.
Yes, please.
You're going to cover that, but there's still going to be a delta between the window and the Linux, right?
Yes.
Because of the editing.
Yeah, yes, yeah. That's why you would want to do this during, relatively lower downtime, where people are not actively using it much.
Now, can I impose like a freeze period? Is there something that I can switch where I won't let user edit or publish in the workbook?
You can do that. So even if you don't provision, the question is, can you do something so that users cannot modify the data on the old site? And answer is yes. Even if you don't have a site, there is a default site on every Tableau cluster, and you can suspend that site. But the bad thing is, people won't be able to access it, so you will have downtime anyways.
But can you make everybody like a viewer or something like
I think some customers use that you
Yeah.
can switch all the users to all the groups to interactor.
Yeah.
And this way they will not be able to modify data and modify business.
Right.
Yeah.
So you can do that. They will still be able to access for read only.
Read only, yeah.
I have to build something to kind of change it back later, right?
Yeah.
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 It shouldn't be too hard, though.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think we have used that internally also.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. All right. We'll have time in the end for more questions. Yes, please. Like, I think, there might be interactions between those processes and Tableau. Usually the recommended thing is when you're running Tableau on a server, you don't want to run anything else on that machine because you paid like good license money for Tableau. You could always provision another machine for that service. I see. So are you trying to use them for the high availability situation that I told about? If, don't take my word for it, but usually if processes are not interacting with Tableau, it should be fine, but usually we don't recommend that. Yeah, because they could. They could be holding on to some file that Tableau uses, for example, and then if Tableau tries to uninstall or install it, that file might be held up. Yeah, yeah. So to recap, we looked at various migration strategies based on your specific situation. Maybe we did not exactly cover your situation, but one of the three might be applicable to you. For most of the customers, the simple backup scenario should suffice. Because if you're used to taking up a backup and restore during some install processes, that mechanism is pretty similar to a backup restore during an upgrade process that some customers do. So that might be suitable for many, many of the customers. We have some helpful links here. This link, all the links are hidden behind the Linux beta program. The beta is far in, advanced now, pretty close to what it would be. I strongly recommend that if you guys haven't signed up for the beta, please sign up for it. You'll get information about the architecture, and you'll also get information about the specific commands that get available, the REST API and all of that. So you can get a preview of what's coming, and you can try it out.
So we wanted, before we go to Q&A, we wanted to point you to some additional sessions that went into a little bit more details on Tableau Server on Linux. The first one by our colleague, Robert Brewer, it talks a lot about all the specific things that go into Tableau Server on Linux, how we make it Linux native, how we package it into RPM and deb, how we provision the users, how we lay files, how we set up permissions, how we use sudoers to elevate some permissions, how we interact with systemd to run those permissions, all these little Linuxy details. If you want to learn more about this, the session, all of these sessions already happened, but, well, maybe except last one. But the recordings are available, so we would highly recommend watching these if you want to get more details on the internals. The second session was a deep dive into the architecture. So like we said, we have a brand new architecture with all these control services, agent, controller, and everything else. So Michael Friedman went into a lot of details of this. It's another very interesting talk. And if you want to learn more about all the data connectivity scenarios, a little bit more details on that run as user setup, how to set up your Kerberos, how to set up your access to the data sources. There's a talk at 12 today about this. So highly recommend to watch these sessions. And again, before we go to Q&A, we would like to ask you to fill out the session survey after we're done here. We love the feedback, we love data. It helps us to improve session for the next conference. So if you guys can fill that out, we would really appreciate it.
And then we do read the feedback.
We
really do.
Of course,
So please, we would like to make it better for the next people who attend this session next time.
Yeah.